for that. Okay, so I'm going to, this whole topic of fire and so on is got many layers in it, and there's a lot of materials that I've kind of assembled and tried to put together here, but I'm really just going to touch on them. And I have made available at, I think it shows the link there, versacolor.ca/fire. The slide deck is available there. So if you go to that site, you can actually download a low resolution version of that slide deck, low resolution, so it's small file size. And you can use that now, or you can use it later, where you want to, do a little more detail with this material. And I kind of look at it as reference material for this topic because there's a lot of interest in it now by the Backlands people and so on and so forth. And basically, what I want to do overall is convince you that the Backlands have exceptional ecological value, and probably this audience doesn't need to be convinced. That it has exceptional recreational value, and again, probably this audience doesn't really have to be convinced. But also that they are exceptionally fire prone, and perhaps in that way do need some convincing. And the main point I'm trying to make, and that I've been pushing for some time now, actually for almost 10 years, is that we need a combined conservation fire management strategy for the Backlands. So we need to consider a strategy that addresses both fire management and safety and conservation where we want to conserve these fire-prone and fire-dependent communities. So that's kind of the main message, if we can kind of try to hold that with us as we go through this material. Now, let's see, okay, so that's showing you what's ahead. So, first of all, just an overview of where fires occur in Canada and Nova Scotia. The top is shows you where fires occurred in Canada between, I think, 2000 and, I just can't see the top of my screen here, between 1985 and 2011. Of course, it's much the same pattern today. And that sweep of orange there is the boreal forest. And you'll notice it doesn't include Nova Scotia. And this just shows you Canada's forest zones. So I can see the boreal forest. And then down on the bottom right, we have the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest and the Acadian forest, which are much more have much more hardwoods in them than the boreal forest. And of course, they're also lower latitudes and so on. Okay, so this slide shows you the frequency of forest fires and other natural disturbances in Nova Scotia. Ecologically, we say that plant communities are structured by by types of disturbances. In the forest, there's three of them. There's fire, there's wind, and disease. Those are the big ones. And it's been a bit controversial in Nova Scotia which ones are most important here. But anyway, there was a recent study done in connection with the Leahy Review, this paper by Taylor shown at the top right. And they compiled a lot of data, and there were some ongoing studies of doing cores and getting charcoal and dating it, so on, by a Russian soil scientist called Elena Ponomarenko. And they came up with some figures. I personally think they're still a bit on the low side because of the way they did sampling. But anyway, the numbers in right there are the fire intervals for different ecosites. So these are sites that are described as black spruce pine, so very much towards the conifer end, and then going down Acadian tolerant hardwood, and you can see the intervals increase. So those intervals, that if you're standing in one of those, you'd expect to see a fire, in that case either a high intensity or moderate intensity, killing 60% to 100% of the stand every 250 to 300 years. If you're an Acadian tolerant hardwood, more like we have out at Sandy Lake, for example, it might be every 500 years. And to put this in perspective, that's Nova Scotia. Top right, for the boreal forests, these intervals are the order of 167 to 180 years. So much less frequent than in the boreal forest. Again, go below that. Over the last, basically, when the settlers came to Nova Scotia, deliberately and inadvertently, the province was just torched up until quite recently. And over that period, the fire return interval was actually less than 100 to 200 years. So a huge difference going from 500 years naturally to something less than even 100 years, a lot of fires. And to give you an idea of what that actually means, if every year now we had fire like we did in 2023, our fire interval would be 165 years. So that shows you gives you a sense of what the boreal forest is like. We think we had a lot of fire. That's routine in the boreal forest. But what's happened in the last 75 years especially is that fire control has become so good that the fire return interval is actually greater than 2,000 years, even greater than 5,000 years. Basically, a fire comes and we put it out. And that has implications for ecosystems that evolved with a much higher level of fire, including the Backlands. So that's kind of the message of those numbers there. There's been a lot of argument about how much of the landscape in Nova Scotia is naturally fire prone and how much isn't. And the numbers go from 1%, less than 1% to 43%. And the government promoted the higher numbers in the past because it sort of favored the concept of clear cutting. Now that's kind of changed with these new numbers, but the critics said, no, it's much less than that. It's around 1%. Regardless, on both sides, people have written in the literature that they regarded the types of areas like the Backlands, these elevated barrens type areas, that those have high natural frequency of fire. There's no disagreement on that. So what I'm trying to do is make the point is that the Backlands are especially fire prone. And we actually did, when I did the studies with Nick Hill of the Williams Lake Backlands, we actually went into a fin and did a core and looked for charcoal layers, and we found in this deeper site, we found 6 distinct charcoal layers. So these would be big fires. And we dated the deepest charcoal, and it was 1,250 years old. So predated the Europeans coming. And that works out to a fire return interval of 208 years. So quite low compared to the other numbers that I presented to you. That doesn't really represent all the fires because those are the big fires. There are lots of other little layers in those cores, which would be surface fires and so on. The point is that this shows you by factual evidence that, again, the Backlands are an especially fire-prone area and have been even before the Europeans arrived. That's the important point. So just to go over a little bit of fires in Nova Scotia, I've put here, this comes from a DNR or NRR table, Nova Scotia's largest fires, and you can see that until recently, the Spryfield fire, which we all remember vividly, I'm sure, was one of the biggest fires in the province for some time. It was actually exceeded the year before by the Porter's Lake fire, but it was up there with the most intense fires. And the bottom right picture is the view from Dartmouth the night of the fire. And I remember that view myself, exactly. And then in 2023, of course, these were dwarfed with the fires we had this year, the Barrington Lake and Tantallon. And collectively, that amounted to about 25,000 hectares in Nova Scotia. Now, an important point about fires in Nova Scotia is that they're 97% human-caused, only 3% by lightning, which is very different from central and western Canada, where lightning is a major cause of the fires. Ours tend to be human-caused fires. Okay, so that's a little bit about the fire. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Backlands. And first of all, go through a bunch of maps. I find maps are a really good way to give us an overview of these things. So the Backlands area, if you're not familiar with it, is the area lying between Herring Cove and Purcell's Cove Road on the southwest and the northeast, and between Williams Lake and Powers Pond going from the northwest to the southeast. So we're all familiar with that area. And it's a large, inside that boundary there, within an urbanized setting. We have a large area, large roadless, essentially wilderness type area in the Backlands, and also with a lot of barrens in it, all that bare rock you see in there. And totally it's 1,350 hectares, which is large for a city area, but it's small in terms of an ecosystem, which is a very important point. Okay, a little bit about the geology. Again, you go back, we saw all of that, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. That sort of bare rock you see there, here. Well, this is all in the superficial geology. That's all classified as rockland. So this is land with, very thin cover soil. It's also elevated, it's near the coast, it's subject to winds, and it dries out very quickly, which is basically why it is so fire prone. This is a sort of 3D image from Google Earth showing a view of the Williams Lake Backlands, and you can see the topography of the area. We have this contact zone between the granites and the Halifax Formation rocks, and along that contact zone, it's kind of like a big valley. That's where we have a lot of wetlands and streams and so on flowing into Culpet Lake, which eventually flows into Williams Lake, and then going into Williams Lake. And on that map that's taken in, I think, late October, the lighter colors, the reddish colors, are all barrens. And that coloration is due to huckleberry, which is growing on those barrens. And it's very much what I describe as a mosaic topography and mosaic habitats. You get little patches of wetlands next to patches of dry land and so on and so forth. Very, very diverse habitats over relatively small areas. Okay. This is a map which shows you the leading forest species. Okay, this is the DNR version of the leading forest species. And you can see there's a lot of that reddish stuff there, and that's actually, I believe, red maple. I think that's where red maple's dominant. The green is black spruce. This area in here is all barrens. Totally lacking here is jack pine. Jack pine, according to this map, is not a leading species in any of those ecosystems, which just contradicts what you see when you go back there. So from the same maps, the forest stand details. So these numbers show you the percentages of different species, which are abbreviated here, and I've underlined jack pine at two levels, where it's second most abundant or third most abundant, and not in any of those is jack pine the most abundant. But if you go in the field, and this is a Google Earth map where we've gone in and ground truthed, those dark green stands are conifers. And everywhere where those kind of dark red are, those are jack pines. Those are jack pine stands. They are not black spruce stands. So what's happened there is that they've been misidentified in the photo interpretation at NRR. There's a lot more jack pine back there than is appreciated. And this is a kind of important thing because that adds to the flammability of the whole situation. And I don't mean, this is not to criticize NRR. These maps are prepared by photo interpretation, and it just reflects the limits of that. So it's not a criticism of them, it's just a fact. However, that the amount of jack pine in the Backlands is not well represented in those maps. There's another issue as well, in that in the NRR forestry maps, to qualify as forester, it has to have greater than 30% tree cover. Okay, and to qualify as barrens, on the other hand, it has to have less than 10% tree cover, according to Jerry Lundholm and Company. The problem is, if you look at the bottom right here, for example, at these barrens here, the whaleback barrens, or the bike barrens as I call them, you're never going to get 30% forest cover there, because you've got these exposed whalebacks, and the jack pines and so on are growing at the edges of them. So, it's just the nature. What I'm trying to say is that the nature of the Backlands is not well represented in some of these maps that are used, used in the strategic decision making and in the, about fire management and other things. That's my point there. Yeah, so we look at those pictures on the top left, number A. That's a mature jack pine forest, about 48 years old. So it burns, and then it goes to B. So you've gone, in that case, that is a closed forest. Okay, that's up above Ocean View, and we know we have closed jack pine forest up there. And then it gets burnt, and it looks like that. And then over time, what happens is you have basically a woodland develop. Woodland is between 10 and 30% forest cover, but not represented on those maps as the, as a leading forest species. Okay, this map is actually a map I just got recently. It was given to me by NRR of the fuel types that they use in to assess fire hazard through the season and so on. There's complex formulas and stuff they use all over Canada. And what's interesting there is that this large kind of purplish stuff here is called Nova Scotia Special Ericaceous Heath. And that's actually a fuel type that is specific to Nova Scotia. And they recognize that we have some exceptionally flammable vegetation types in Nova Scotia. And it's not referring to jack pines in particular. It's referring to these shrublands. It was actually based a lot on observations of shrublands in Cape Breton. The point is that is the most flammable category of forests in Nova Scotia, and a lot of that applies to the Backlands. Again, I'm just trying to underscore that it's a highly fire. I just want to look briefly at the plant communities in the Backlands, and these are as documented in a lengthy study that Nick Hill and I did, and it was published in 2014 of the Backlands. So it's all available. And on the web page that I gave you, the sources of these materials are there. So we distinguished seven vegetation types in the Backlands. 2 of them are Barrens types. Those are 1 and 2. The third one, the jack pine, broom crowberry barrens, kind of fall, as I've tried to explain, between barrens. Oh, thank you, sweeties. Kind of fall between barrens and forest in the classification, but also in time, because when the forest burns, it goes back to barrens. Over time, goes through barrens to woodland to forest. And then the other types are all classic forest types that correspond to types of forests in the Nova Scotian forest vegetation system. One of them, actually, this number 4, red pine, jack pine, broom crowberry, is actually also a very rare ecosystem. Like the jack pine, broom crowberry barrens, those are both very rare vegetation types anywhere, and they both occur in the Backlands. Then we have this one. Oh, by the way, I should say they've got fire symbols on them where these are highly fire adapted communities. All the species in there are adapted to fires. But the 2 types of communities are early successional forests that follow fire, and they're also, all of these species have mechanisms to survive fire in these 2 vegetation types. And then finally we come to white pine, red oak mixed forest. That's the type of forest you see, in the Shaw Wilderness. And it has kind of 2, it has forest that's subject to repeated fires and has a suite of species associated with that. But then closer to the water corridors, to Lawson's Brook and to the stream that goes from Colpit Lake into Williams Lake, then we have a suite of plants which are that are not adapted to fire. So things like, especially like yellow birch, hobblebush, polypody fern, all those types of things you only find in the wetter areas. So that vegetation type is mixed. It has fire adapted species and species that are not fire adapted according to their locations. Okay, so let's look a little bit at some of the adaptations of Backlands plants to fire. And there's different schemes for classifying these. I like this particular one, which comes from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, but reflects, commonly used sorts of classifications. And it divides the adaptations into sprouters, seeders, resistors, invaders, and avoiders. So I'm going to go through and give you some examples of those of plants in the Backlands with illustrations from the from pictures taken post after the Spryfield fire. So what really comes up quickly are what we call sprouters. And these are plants in which the tops completely burn off, but new sprouts arise from underground parts. So in this case, from the root crown at the base of the stem or in the roots. Examples are big-tooth aspen, wire birch, and withrod. Okay? And that was a spring fire, and only the top few millimeters of the soil burnt. These soils aren't thick, but there's stuff surviving below that, that's what these things regenerate from very quickly. Other types are rhizomes, and also even bulb or bulb-like structures, like pink lady slipper. You wouldn't think it's fire tolerant, but it is. And it was there in June after the fire on May 1st in 2009. So these sprouters come up very quickly. Okay, another type of adaptation are cedars, and there's two types. There's what's called an above ground seed bank, and the epitome of that is jack pine. So jack pine accumulates over its time what it's called serotinous cones. They're cones that are sealed shut by resins. And those cones that are sealed shut by resins will only open when there's a fire. Now, jack pines will also have some non-serotinous cones. You can see both, but if there's areas of repeated fire, then at least 75% of the cones are these serotinous types. And they accumulate these cones through their lifetime. So over time, there's more and more seed accumulating in those trees, and then when you have a fire, all of that seed is released. Okay, and then there are below ground cedars. And the epitome of that in the Backlands is broom crowberry. And broom crowberry actually has, when its fruit, it has a circle of tissue around the fruit called an olasome, which is fatty tissue, which is attractive to ants. And ants take the fruit and bury it below ground. So that may not be very deep, maybe 3 inches, but it's enough to escape the fire. And during the fire, broom crowberry is completely killed by the fire, but those seeds survive below ground. In the case of broom crowberry, they don't come up until a year after the fire. Like I didn't see any in the fall of 2009. I did see them by the fall of 2010, and that's consistent with observations other places. There's many other types of seeds that survive fire. For example, pinweed is one that comes up pretty quickly. There's a lot of things, but the seed bank is slower than the sprouters. But the first things you see are mostly these sprouters. Okay, and then there's what called the resistors, and these are trees when they get old. The lower parts have thick enough bark that they can withstand fire, and that's really important in the Backlands. And those trees in our Backlands are white pine, red pine, and red oak. And with their roughly 60 years or older, and there's a surface fire, not a huge canopy fire, but a surface fire, they'll survive it. And what we can often see today are the fire scars from those fires. And what happens then is that the other trees are all replaced by the fire, but these big pines and so on are retained. So when you walk in the Williams Lake Backlands, the big trees are the white pine, the red oak, and the red pine. On the right-hand side shows you up at the bike barrens, and there's from the 2009 fire, that white pine towering over all of the other vegetation. And this is very important ecologically, because even though these forest types are mostly, most of the trees have not been around for a long time. There's not old growth. But these big trees give us components of old growth in the Backlands. And many of these trees are well over 100 years old, even up probably 150 years old. And and they fall down in windstorms and so on and so forth, and give you many of the characteristics of old growth. So while we don't have what would qualify as old growth in the Backlands, we have important components of old growth. And that's really important ecologically. So that was showing you white pine, but we also red pine and red oak, and you've seen these in the Backlands. This is up around Culpet Lake at the top right. Some huge oaks up there. Everything else is small. So those survived the fire, and that's an important component of these ecosystems. Okay, then we have the invaders, and in many ecosystems, when they get disturbed or burnt over or whatever, that's the time people are concerned about invasive species coming in. And it's very interesting that in the Backlands, we have what we call the wildland urban interface, the WUI, is always very close to the Backlands, to the undeveloped Backlands. And there's tons of stuff that could invade there, exotic species and invasive species. But it doesn't. You find it around the trailheads, but it doesn't go into the Backlands. And that's evidence of high ecological integrity, and also reflects the peculiar soil conditions, which are very acidic and nutrient poor. So they're kind of unusual in that sense, that we tend to have very few invaders after the fires. We're getting bits and pieces here and there, but to get a lot of them, we'd have to add a lot of nutrients and do that sort of thing. So it's another really interesting ecological feature of the Backlands. And then finally, the avoiders. Well, the avoiders are the ones we've already talked about, things like hobblebush and so on, that they can't withstand fire at all. The only place we get hemlocks are around where there are residences. So the hemlocks will survive there because of a high degree of fire control. Hemlocks cannot withstand any fire at all, nor can yellow birch. And you only find yellow birch along the stream corridors. Whereas if you go, for instance, around Sandy Lake up in the Drumlins, it's full of yellow birch. So that's a reflection that these Backlands are mostly, there's a lot of fire. There's not a lot of fire out around Sandy Lake. Okay, so I've got a few pictures. I'll just go through these kind of quickly. When the 2009 fire occurred, I was out there within 4 days to look at what's happening, and actually a helicopter came in from DNR and told me to get out because there was still stuff smoldering under the ground. But what I wanted to see those jack pine cones opening and the seeds flying out and going on the soil, and they were. And subsequently I followed the succession of plants in a fair amount of detail for up to 2 years. At the same time, Richard Beasley, who many of you know, is a member of the Halifax Field Naturalists, I think also the Wildflower Society. He was also spending a lot of time back there and documenting photographically the succession, and we put together a set of slides showing that succession, and it's available on the Halifax Field Naturalists web. June 6, 2009. So the fire was barely over a month. And you go in there, there's already lots of bracken fern coming up. So again, these are the fire-adapted species. Whoops, there's the fern coming up. Also, the orchid, like I showed you. Also, you're starting to get stump sprouts from things like red maple and the birches. So stuff coming up very quickly after the fire. And then by October, you really have a lot of cover on that burned over forest in the Backland. And that all reflects those kinds of adaptations that we're talking about. So the point is that all of these systems in the Backlands, except close to the stream corridors, are all the species in them are adapted in some way to fire at fairly short intervals. This is golden heather, which is one of the rare plant species. And it comes up from a seed bank, but only in the second year after the fire, or only after 1 year after the fire, not earlier. And these species, in the pine barrens, we have some rare species, and they're kind of dependent on fire. So right now we still have a lot of golden heather in the areas that burn, but over time it'll get displaced by the slower growing broom crowberry. So again, we need the fire in this case for some of these rare species. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the overall conservation and recreational values of the Backlands. So this shows you the land ownership in the backlands, and the colored lands are essentially all protected in some way or another. The light green at the bottom are crown lands, so they're not formally protected, but they're not developed without a lot of trouble. We have the Nature Conservancy in there. We have the Nova Scotia Nature Trust, and we have HRM. All have lands back there, and collectively, I haven't estimated it recently, but I'm collectively, I would say right now, it's about 62% of the undeveloped area of the backlands is protected in some way or another. What isn't protected are those white areas. And we could say, well, okay, you've got enough protected, but if we now develop those white areas, those other areas wouldn't last. They're not going to last in fragmentation. So we need to, if we want to keep the backlands as an ecologically intact area, we have to acquire more of those lands that are not now in the protected in some way or another. A feature that I've highlighted in the backlands that Nick Hill and I highlighted when we did our study that you've probably all heard about are the jack pine, broom, crowberry barrens. And these occur at the edge of the open barrens where you get the jack pines. You also get broom crowberry. And we identified it as a unique assemblage because it's a combination of two species which are not themselves rare in Nova Scotia. The jack pine is very abundant in boreal forest. In Nova Scotia, it's at the southern limit of its distribution. The broom crowberry, on the other hand, is a coastal plain species, and it's at the northern limit of its distribution. And what's unique about this is the combination of this boreal species and this coastal plain species, both highly fire-dependent species in these pine barrens. And that is really very unique. It only occurs, there's only one example, very limited examples of it in Maine. In general, in Maine, in the pine barrens, jack pine is replaced by pitch pine. So there's just a limited amount of it in Maine. It doesn't occur in any other provinces except Nova Scotia. And in Nova Scotia, it only occurs on scattered outcrops along the Atlantic coast from the Aspetuagon Peninsula to Canso. And that's it. And some of the best examples of it are in our own backlands. So it's a really important conservation element, a reason that we want to try to conserve these ecosystems. However, if we look at all of these vegetation types in the backlands, they are all characteristic of pine barrens of a more general type. Now, pine barrens in the United States and a lot of the rest of Canada are highly valued, or have very high conservation value, and they're fire-dependent systems, and they're recognized as having very high conservation value for their own sake and because they harbor rare species and so on. So, that's a thing that we really need to appreciate here, that we have this very special pine barrens that are highly valued elsewhere. They're also even special amongst the pine barrens for one reason, because of that broom crowberry jack pine association I talked about. Also, they're rockland. Most of these other barrens are sandy soils. They're not rocklands. Ours are quite unique that way. In addition, I think what's really remarkable, and this I only realized when I started to put some of this material together, is that of the 5 forest vegetation types in the backlands, these all occur in a relatively small area, and they are the equivalent of the diversity found in much larger pine barrens in the United States. So even though it's a small area, it's incredibly diverse, which relates to that mosaic of habitats that I've talked about. So these are some of the things that I see as really ecological highlights of the backlands. Also, there's the wetlands. I'm not going to go into that because I gave you another whole webinar on that recently, but we have some very exceptional types of wetlands, and they're mostly small, but collectively very important. So we have a lot of, for example, between the whalebacks, you have wetlands. They're too small to be protected, but collectively they're incredibly important. We have vernal pools all over the place in the Backlands. We have these boulder fields and so on. So very unique types of wetlands in the Backlands. And those are documented in a webinar that I gave back in August. Okay, now the birders have been back there for a long time. Fulton lavender and Joshua Bars Dunham amongst them, are prominent amongst them, I think. And Fulton's been going on for years about this. Backlands are really special for birds, and indeed they are. And I'm not a birder at all, so I'm relying on on what they tell us. But the Backlands support birds in migration. They support migratory breeders. They support permanent residents, and they support birds of forest, open habitat, and wetlands. All of that in that little area of 1,350 hectares. Now, one thing I was interested in was, are there old forest species in the Backlands? And I suggested to Joshua that he look at this paper by Betts, 2022. It's quite a well-recognized paper. And it was really the first paper to document that the decline of many of our birds in the temperate region, they're not related to problems in the wintering ground. They're related to clear cutting of our forests here. It's quite a revolutionary paper. And he showed that all kinds of birds that depend on intact forest habitat have gone down over the last 40 years. You can relate it to clear cutting. Where you have intact forests, you've got the birds. Where you've got clear cutting, you don't. And anyway, you have birds of early, mid, and late succession. And what I was interested in was how many birds characteristic of old forest do we have in the Backlands? And Joshua went into this, compiled the data, and so on. There's a lot of old forest birds in the Backlands, and that's related to those big trees I talked about. Those big resistant trees. That's what's providing the old forest habitat in a forest which is generally a much younger forest. Again, another really interesting, unique features of these Backlands. Now, what's really exciting, and I'm going to ask Joshua to talk a little bit about this when we begin the discussion, but Fulton's been going on for years about the goat suckers, the insectivores in the Backlands, and saying how special it is. And this past summer, some people at the Williams Lake Conservation Company got together and they started doing some monitoring of nighthawks in the Backlands. They wanted to find out how abundant they are. And they talked to Cindy Stacier at Dalhousie University and got some recording devices and so on and so forth and placed them all over the Backlands. And I'll let Joshua talk a little bit more about this later. But there's a lot of nighthawk activity in the Backlands, and Cindy Stacier was really excited about that. Because it's a threatened species, it's an insectivore, and you know how the insects are declining, and so are the insectivorous birds. So that's really significant. But to relate it to all of that habitat, they're nesting on the barrens types area, but they're eating the insects that come from the wetlands. So that juxtaposition of the barrens and the wetlands in the Backlands adds up to really good habitat for nighthawks. So I don't know. That's just so exciting, I think. Anyway, there's a little bit of information about it there. They migrate down to South America and so on. But I'll let Joshua say a few words about it afterwards. And I'm kind of announcing it publicly before they have. So. They've given me permission to use these slides and so on, and like I said, I'll ask Joshua to talk about it because I think it kind of encapsulates so many of these features, unique features of the Backlands. And what a wonderful bird those night. I remember those from when I was a kid. We had tons of them where I grew up, and the sounds of them at night and so on. And to think that they've almost disappeared, but here we have in a major urban area, we have great nighthawk habitat. It's just incredible. Now, there's many, and I think all of us here appreciate those other values, the values for recreation, for health, for tourism, for education, all so close. For me, it's wonderful. I don't like driving a car, and I can get in my car in 15 minutes.
I can be at the beginning of the Shaw Wilderness, and in half an hour I can be basically out in the wilderness. And so many people can do that in Halifax with so many entrance points. It's just amazing, and can be used for so many purposes and have so many values. I don't think I really need to underscore that too much. So the point is that, simple point to be made is that the backlands have important ecological and recreational features. So then let's connect that with the fire. So what's the frequency and severity of the fires, and how do we deal with them? So just to mention wetlands, you say, okay, what about our wetlands? Well, in the fire, the larger wetlands stop the progress of the fire, as shown at the X's on this map up here. And these are some examples of that. Those will stop, but we don't have a lot of those large wetlands in the back. Not enough. You know, they're important where they occur, but they're not going to stop fires in the backlands. The smaller wetlands, on the other hand, were burned, but like the forest, they recovered. Not as quickly, but within 3 years, most of those smaller wetlands were pretty well recovered. So again, the species that occur in those smaller wetlands are species adapted to some level of fire. So how often and how severe are the fires in the backlands? We've got a list of some. When Nick and I did the study, I tried to find out what people knew about past fires, and they're listed on the left. Of those, the Spryfield fire was the biggest. But what we can say really is, based on the jack pine, we can say something about how frequently fires are. And the estimates of fire intervals in jack pine forests are generally less than 50 years. In other words, you're not going to maintain a jack pine forest with very long fire intervals. Okay, so that's some indication. And what happens is, when those jack pines get up around over 40 years old, they're very flammable. And they have a lot of ladder fuel. You know, they don't lose the old branches. You can see the picture here on the right. Those old branches stay there. The people even call them pyrogenic. They like fire. And they're completely killed by the fire, but they survive by their seeds. So the presence of those jack pines is indicative of relatively short fires. Now, the key point here is that these forests need to burn regularly to be maintained, but when the fire is suppressed, that kindling builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up. And it's a classic problem that a lot of, like we've had in the Western Canada and the United States. By suppressing fire so much, when the fires finally occur, it's a huge crown fire. They're very, very intensive fires and very hard to deal with. So that's the issue. You know, we don't want to have fires in our urban area, but if we stop them in the backlands, guaranteed we're going to have a repeat of the Spryfield fire pretty soon. In some areas, pretty soon. There's areas in the backlands that are definitely, you know, well past the prime for burning. And, you know, Nick and I kind of inferred just from general observations that the driest areas are these open barrens and the junction with the jack pine areas. And in fact, some modeling by Ellen Whitman, who did did a master thesis at Dalhousie. You know, she's the person you hear on the CBC and so on a lot. Now works out of Alberta, is kind of considered the national expert on wildland fires. And her modeling, in fact, is consistent with that idea that these areas are the matchsticks, these open barren areas. So I get really upset when I see fire pits in those areas, because those are areas that are, you know, can flame up very quickly. So that's a little bit of the background about the fire, some of the features affecting the fire. So then we come to, okay, how do we deal with it? And this is my final slide and the kind of thoughts I've been trying to put together. And, you know, what I'm pushing here is that we try to work towards a combined conservation fire management strategy for the backlands. So I put down what I consider some possible elements of that. You know, I'm not an expert in this. I've just studied stuff I've got from studying literature and talking to people and yickety-yak. So we need to talk to experts, but here's just some initial ideas. First of all, it's important to conserve as much as possible of the existing undeveloped backlands so as not to increase the wildland-urban interface. You know, if you have, for example, Ocean View Drive is a linear structure going into the Backlands, and that just greatly increases the wildland-urban interface. Same thing with Aaron's Way. You know, people didn't appreciate that when they did it, but the more little indents we make, that just greatly increases the wildland-urban interface, and the problem of fire in the Backlands and the problem, yeah, just generally it's an issue for both conservation. It fragments the Backlands ecologically, but it also increases the fire hazard. So the second point is that we need to make fire smart practices with 10 to 30 meters of, quote, defensible space essential for all structures on the periphery of the Backlands. And, you know, and some examples of where we have it and don't have, or have elements of it and don't, are shown on the left. The middle one is probably the best. The top one is out by the Governor Brook Barrens, and I'd be worried once that forest grows up. It's awful close to all those houses without more protection. And the bottom one shows you a house basically built in a jack pine forest, as was the case in Aaron's Way before the fire. So that's where we need to bring these fire smart practices. And then in addition, we need to institute fuel reduction, which means perhaps sending the trees, taking off lower branches and so on over an additional 30 meters to give us an additional area where the fire is going to be slowed. I think that's essential for the Backlands. And you can see that if we develop into the Backlands, how that becomes much more problematical. Okay, point number 4 is we should map and age all the jack pine stands, the area of the 2000 and 2012 fires, which we can still detect, and then we should monitor and map the areas of future fires throughout the Backlands and use this to generate a fire probability map and models. It's just basic stuff that needs to go into it. And then finally, you know, in the United States, prescribed fire is very controversial. And in Canada, I've had people in Nova Scotia tell me, you know, forester experts, there's no way we're ever going to have prescribed fire in Nova Scotia. The public just won't put up with it. And that's been the attitude through a lot of North America until this year. But in the Pine Barrens, they've been practicing prescribed fires for years. There's a lot of prescribed fires conducted on Pine Barrens in the United States. They have a lot of experience with it. So what I'm suggesting is that we seek some of those folks to assess our Backlands and give us advice, and including the use of prescribed fire. Now, the big difference between our Pine Barrens and those other ones in the States is the size. Ours is 1,350 hectares. We're talking about, you know, many square kilometers, and these, you know, even hundreds of square kilometers in some of these things in the States. So quite different situations that we have to look at, and we have to approach this very carefully. But I hope you can appreciate my argument that we can't do nothing. If we do nothing, we're going to have bad fires, or we're going to lose our Backlands. So essentially, yeah, that's my message for tonight. And then finally, open up for discussion. And I'd like to ask Joshua perhaps to begin. Bob, if you want to moderate this, if we can hear a few words, Joshua, about the Nighthawk, about the Nighthawks.
Well, thank you, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I helped out with the survey that Fulton led in 2021, the bird survey in the Backlands, where he was very excited to see a pair of adults and a pair of, sort of in early August, a pair of juveniles flying across the lower McIntosh Run. I know that there were a couple of sightings of nighthawks last year in 2022. None of that prepared me for this year being part of this project, and just how much activity there is in the Backlands.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we especially the area, the barrens around Governor's Brook housing development, south of it and east of it in the barrens. We heard young nighthawks in the nest, and parents, adult nighthawks calling to each other. We several times saw the nighthawks, the male nighthawks, booming, doing this behavior where they sweep up high into the sky and then drop down and then pull their wings in, much like a osprey. If you've seen an osprey hunting for fish, and then pull their wings in as they come up. And as they pull their wings up just a meter before the ground, they pull out of this dive and angle their wings in such a way that the air rushing over the tips of the wings creates this whooshing sound, which they call a boom. Yeah. So all this, it didn't prepare me for it whatsoever.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. So it was just amazing, and all this data now that has come back from the autonomous recording unit that Dr. Stacer lent us. The recording unit was set up so that it recorded a couple of hours either side of sunrise and sunset. And it records in 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off. So you get these 10-minute length recordings. Several of those recordings, there were over 500 captures of nighthawk sounds in a single recording. So, all of this sort of as well as being just very exciting and exciting to be part of, is encouraging to me in just in the importance of protecting the backlands, protecting those habitats, those different habitats that can support this threatened species.
No, that's just
it's just
wonderful.
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't know. I grew up with nighthawks. To me, they were just like, so I know exactly the sound you're talking about.
Yeah. It's like
it's amazing when you think of it. That I mean, you're a bird watcher, another bird watcher, and so on. We haven't really been aware of it because they are restricted to the undeveloped, largely restricted to the undeveloped areas of the backlands.
Yeah.
And people aren't out there at night and early in the morning and so on whenever they're active. So just so fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So
just great.
I'm curious, comparing it to when we went out, David. You went out to the Tantalon area, and then you went out again near Cox's Lake. Right?
Yeah.
And, certainly, it appeared to be quite different. The process that was going on, the regenerative process. You want to say anything about that, maybe?
Yeah, the areas where fires occurred in Nova Scotia this year, and this is Ellen Whitman says this. Those are conifer forests that burned, and they're basically, forests that were clear-cut and herbicided, and they're grown up in conifers, and they're part of what some people call borealization of our forests, and it's a controversial term. The DNR doesn't like it, but that's what those forests are. We have just through our history of repeated disturbance and burning and so on, and then deliberate use of herbicides and short rotations, we've created sweeps of forests that are very fire susceptible. Now, I was really interested to go out and have a look, which I did with Bob, and then went another place. And very interesting stuff's coming up, but not nearly as intense when I reflect on it as in the backlands. So in a way, I'm just thinking about it today. In a way, those forests are adapted to clear cutting, but they're not that well adapted to fire because we've been suppressing the fires in these areas. Just interesting stuff. So I think, they're quite different from the backlands. They're more soil and so on, but there's not nearly as much stuff coming up. It's another feature which kind of distinguishes, makes the backlands, I think, really quite unique.
Remember, one of the things that struck me was that in the Tantalon area, there was a few stump sprouts, mostly aspen and some bit of red maple coming up, but there wasn't anywhere near as much sprouting going on as I was expecting to see. What it appeared to be was seedlings that were developing. And what was very curious to me is that the seeds that were developing were not reflective of the plants in the area, the unburned areas immediately around it. So these were things like wild raspberry and bristly sarsaparilla and some grasses and sedges, and we could not find their counterparts in the surrounding areas.
Yeah.
And what we believe has been the case is that since the area was clear cut, I think, would you think 40 years ago or so?
I'm guessing about 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah, that there's a seed bank has been remained in the soil that time. And these are seeds like 40-year-old raspberry seeds and stuff that have been, have finally germinated and started to reemerge. And they're kind of sporadic, like it's not a big flush of growth. But it's enough to have a bit of a green cover. Yeah.
I mean, but the bristly sarsaparilla I found kind of intriguing because there was a lot of it in areas of Point Pleasant Park that blew down for a period.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
all over the place for a period. I have some documentation of it. So yeah, it's really interesting. The ecology of those types of things is fascinating, I think. And like you said, did it come from seed outside? Was it an invader, or was it a
Well, the thing
seed?
is, the area burned, like in Tantalon, it burned in late May, so there wouldn't have been any external seed coming in at that time of year. It wouldn't ripen until
I
much.
wouldn't think so.
Yeah, but it must have been in the soil at least over 1 year, but
Yeah,
particularly
wouldn't
a lot
think so.
longer than that. Yeah.
Sorry.
So, do you think the controlled burns are going to happen? Like, has there been any discussion along those lines? Do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think, like I said, there's a lot of resistance to it, but I started to hear some discussion of it this summer. But the Backlands is a particularly tricky area because it's a small area and because there's so much urban interface. And that's why I'm suggesting we need to recognize that and have these zones around the outside.
Do you think
And
the fire marshals would see it as a beneficial thing, like would understand the greater benefit, or do you think they would see it more as just threatening?
Yeah, we may not actually need that much because if you look at the Jack Pine Barrens from Aspetogan down to Kensal, we have some of the best ones in terms of living trees. As you go down towards Kensal, those barrens have aged a lot and are starting to lose them. And the reason is that the level of fire control is so intense that it's like I said, the fire return interval is longer than it is, much longer than it is naturally. And so what happens in HRM is that we have lots of population and lots of people setting fires and we put them out quickly. So there's actually, as it exists, there's a kind of patchwork of ages in there. The thing we got to watch for is a big fire like Spryfield fire. So that's why I'm saying to get a handle on that, in my thinking about it, we need to map these areas. And then when we have fires, so we have an idea, what that mosaic is. And, and then we can get some assessment. Okay, we've got a large area there that's around 50 years. Maybe we need to think about it. And that's where you need the help from. And these prescribed fires are not like set in the summer. They're set in winter, things like that.
Right.
And the Pine Barren people, they're the experts. Like they know about it. So I can't really comment on it, but those guys can comment on it. And I think, we need to ask the questions. I think.
I think you gave a really thorough presentation, David.
It's
Good.
a bit hurried. Apologize.
Well, Yeah, you covered a lot of ground, so it was really.
And the materials, I've given a link, which gives more links. Everything I've talked about is well documented. There's I have a lot of documentation, a lot of pictures, and so on. So like I said, I was really trying to just make this overall point, about these values. But there's a lot that's available about it, and also Joshua's wonderful Nighthawk project.
Yeah, that's
To cap it all off, I think it's just great. So good to have good ecological news these days. Really
that's what's happening in the places we're not able to see normally. Eh?
exactly.
That's-
Yeah.
Well, I think we've had pretty good sessions. Any more comments from anybody? Thank you very much. This is a very interesting presentation tonight, David, from Karen Hertzberg.
Thank you.
And